On May 1st, 1999, American climber Conrad Anker was scanning the frozen wasteland of Everest's north face when something caught his eye. What he initially thought was a smooth white boulder turned out to be far more significant. The bleached torso of a man, face down in the scree, arms extended upward as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. After 75 years entombed in ice at 26,760 feet, George Mallory had been found. The discovery reignited one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries. Did Mallory and his 22-year-old partner, Andrew Sandy Irvine, reach the summit of Mount Everest on June 8, 1924, a full 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's celebrated first ascent? The question has haunted explorers, historians, and armchair detectives for a century, spawning countless theories, expeditions, and controversies. The body told a brutal story. Mallory's right leg was badly broken, his forehead bore a penetrating wound with 2 protruding skull fragments, and a length of climbing rope was wound tightly around his torso, evidence of a catastrophic fall. But 2 critical pieces of evidence were conspicuously absent: a photograph of his wife Ruth, which family members believed he'd promised to leave at the summit, and a Kodak vest pocket camera that might contain proof of their achievement. The absence of that photograph has become as significant as anything found on Mallory's body. His daughter Claire later revealed that her father had promised Ruth he would bury her photo in the snow at the summit as a symbol of devotion and triumph. When researchers in 1999 found letters, an altimeter, spare goggles, and other personal effects but no photograph, speculation erupted. Had Mallory fulfilled his promise? Had he stood atop the world's highest peak before plummeting to his death on the descent? George Herbert Lee Mallory was born on June 18, 1886, in the pastoral English village of Mobberley, Cheshire, the son of a local vicar. Nothing about his upbringing suggested he would become synonymous with one of exploration's greatest enigmas. Yet beneath the veneer of Victorian propriety burned an uncommon restlessness, a yearning for vertical spaces and impossible challenges. At Winchester College, where he won a mathematics scholarship at age 13, a geography teacher named R.L. Irving first introduced young Mallory to the Alps. The mountains awoke something primal in him. Contemporaries described his climbing style as almost feline, graceful, instinctive, seemingly fearless on exposed rock faces where others froze in terror. At Cambridge's Magdalene College, Mallory moved in rarefied intellectual circles, befriending luminaries of the Bloomsbury Group, including economist John Maynard Keynes, writer Lytton Strachey, and poet Rupert Brooke. The artist Duncan Grant painted him multiple times, capturing both his physical beauty and the restless energy that seemed barely contained by drawing rooms and academic halls. Yet Mallory remained something of an outsider among these aesthetes and philosophers. While they debated ideas, he craved experience, particularly the transcendent communion he found on rock and ice. In his private writings, he described climbing as a form of prayer. "When I am on rock, I pray, but not with words. I pray with my body, every muscle, every breath. It is understanding that I am alive." After Cambridge, Mallory took a teaching position at Charterhouse School, where one of his pupils was Robert Graves, who would later become a renowned poet. Graves remembered his teacher as wasted in the classroom, constantly attempting to befriend students in ways that confused rather than inspired them. Mallory's heart was clearly elsewhere, in the mountains that called to him with increasing urgency. In 1914, he married Ruth Turner, and their correspondence reveals a man deeply torn between domestic obligations and his obsession with climbing. In one poignant letter, Ruth wrote, "I think I want your companionship even more than I used to. I know I have rather often been cross and not nice, and I am very sorry, but the bottom reason has nearly always been because I was unhappy at getting so little of you." The mountains were his rival, and she knew it. By the 1920s, with the North and South Poles conquered, the British Empire sought a new symbol of dominance: Mount Everest, the third pole. Access was granted through Tibet, as Nepal's borders remained closed, limiting expeditions to the mountain's treacherous northern approaches. Mallory participated in the 1921 reconnaissance expedition that first mapped the northern route via the North Col and Northeast Ridge, the path he would eventually die attempting. The 1922 expedition brought both triumph and tragedy. Physicist George Finch used supplemental oxygen to reach a record altitude of 27,000 feet, while an avalanche claimed the lives of 7 Sherpa porters, a catastrophe that haunted Mallory for the rest of his life. In a devastating letter to Ruth on June 9, 1922, Mallory wrote, "The consequences of my mistake are so terrible. It seems almost impossible to believe that it has happened forever, and that I can do nothing to make good. There is no obligation I have so much wanted to honor as that of taking care of these men." The words reveal a man with a conscience far more nuanced than the stereotypical imperial adventurer. The oxygen question became contentious. Mallory initially viewed supplemental oxygen as unsporting, a technological cheat that undermined the purity of the climb. But pragmatism eventually overrode philosophy. After his first failed attempt in 1924 without oxygen, Mallory acknowledged reality. Everest demanded every advantage available. The selection of personnel for the 1924 expedition revealed the political machinations beneath the heroic narrative. Arthur Hincks, secretary of the Mount Everest Committee, wanted the first ascent to be unmistakably British. Despite his proven performance, George Finch, born in Australia, was excluded, ostensibly for being too independent. Mallory initially refused to participate without Finch, but relented under pressure that reportedly involved King George V's personal interest in the expedition. For the final summit push, Mallory made a controversial choice. Instead of selecting the experienced climber Noel Odell, he chose 22-year-old Andrew Common, Sandy Irvine, an engineering student from Oxford's Merton College with minimal mountaineering experience. The decision baffled expedition leader Edward Norton, but Mallory's logic was sound. Irvine was a mechanical genius who had modified the expedition's notoriously unreliable oxygen apparatus, eliminating leaks and reducing weight by 5 pounds. In a frustrated letter home, Irvine had written, "The oxygen apparatus has already been boggled. They haven't taken my design, but what they have sent is hopeless." He then proceeded to fix what British engineering had bungled. For Mallory, who now understood that oxygen was essential to success, having the system's architect alongside him was more valuable than another experienced climber who couldn't maintain or repair the equipment under extreme conditions. Irvine's final diary entry, written on June 6 from the North Col, betrayed both his youth and determination. "My face is perfect agony. Have prepared 2 oxygen apparatus for our start tomorrow morning." Despite severe frostbite, the young engineer worked through the night readying the systems that might deliver them to the summit. 2 weeks before his death, Mallory penned a letter to Ruth that would become one of mountaineering's most haunting documents. Writing from Camp 4th after his first failed attempt, he confessed, "This has been a bad time altogether. I look back on tremendous efforts and exhaustion and dismal looking out of a tent door and onto a world of snow and vanishing hopes. And yet, there have been a good many things to set on the other side. Darling, I wish you the best I can, that your anxiety will be at an end before you get this, with the best news, which will also be the quickest. It is 50-1 against us, but we'll have a whack yet and do ourselves proud. The phrase 50-1 against us reveals Mallory was no reckless adventurer, but rather a realistic assessor of their minuscule chances. Yet he would go anyway. The psychological profile that emerges is complex. A man who understood the odds but felt compelled, perhaps by pride, perhaps by imperial expectations, perhaps by something deeper, to attempt the impossible anyway. While Mallory prepared for his oxygen-assisted attempt, Norton and Somerville made a remarkable push without supplemental oxygen. Following a traverse across the north face through what became known as the Norton Couloir, Norton reached approximately 28,126 feet, within 1,000 vertical feet of the summit, and establishing an altitude record that would stand for decades. Norton descended snow-blind and exhausted, having turned back less than 300 meters below the summit. His achievement proved the summit was within reach, but reinforced Mallory's conviction that oxygen would be necessary. On June 6th, Mallory and Irvine departed Camp 4th with porters carrying 6 oxygen cylinders to Camp 6th at approximately 26,800 feet. The load was deliberately heavy. They were banking everything on maximum oxygen reserves for the summit push. A note Mallory left listing equipment and supplies would later be found by Odell, confirming they had substantial oxygen capacity for their attempt. The night of June 7th or 8th, their final night alive, remains shrouded in mystery. Did they rest well? Did the oxygen equipment malfunction, causing delays in departure? When Odell later visited Camp 6th, he found it in chaotic order, with spare oxygen parts scattered about, suggesting last-minute repairs or adjustments. Geologist Noel Odell was climbing in support when, at 12:50 p.m., the clouds parted briefly. In his own words, "At 12:50, just after I had emerged in a state of jubilation at finding the first definite fossils on Everest, there was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere, and the entire summit ridge and final peak of Everest were unveiled." Through that momentary window, Odell saw 2 tiny figures ascending, going strong for the top, near one of the prominent rock steps on the northeast ridge. Within moments, clouds obscured the view again. It was the last time anyone would see Mallory and Irvine alive. The significance of Odell's observation has been debated for a century. Initially, he placed them near the 3rd step, tantalizingly close to the summit. Later accounts varied, with Odell sometimes describing the location as the 2nd or even 1st step. The ambiguity is critical. The 2nd step, a nearly vertical 40-meter rock face, represents the route's most technical obstacle. Modern climber Conrad Anker free-climbed the 2nd step in 1999, now equipped with a ladder installed by Chinese climbers in 1975, to test whether Mallory could have managed it with 1924 equipment. His conclusion? Technically possible, but extremely difficult and dangerous, especially on descent. The mystery deepens with a controversial theory proposed by some researchers that expedition leader Norton deliberately downplayed Odell's initial report to reduce speculation that the summit had been reached. This official narrative manipulation theory suggests political motivations, preserving the allure of an unconquered Everest for future British attempts. While lacking definitive proof, the documented discrepancies between Odell's field notes and published accounts lend the theory circumstantial credibility. Between Odell's 12:50 p.m. sighting and sunset around 6 p.m., Mallory and Irvine vanished into what mountaineering researcher Jake Norton calls the lost hours. What happened during that critical window? Weather deteriorated significantly in the afternoon with increasing winds and cloud cover. Modern meteorological analysis confirms that a storm system moved across Everest that evening. For climbers already at the limits of human endurance, descending technical terrain in deteriorating visibility would have been catastrophic. The most thorough reconstruction comes from Norton, who spent years analyzing the evidence. His scenario, Mallory and Irvine reached the summit late, dangerously late, perhaps near sunset, then began descending in gathering darkness. Without headlamps, not invented until decades later, they navigated by feel and fading light. Descending the second step at night would have required the rope technique known as courte-échelle, one climber serving as a human ladder for the other. Norton theorizes the rope caught on a rock projection and, under strain, snapped. The break is consistent with the frayed rope fragment found wrapped around Mallory's torso. Mallory's injuries tell a specific story. The broken right fibula, puncture wound to the forehead, and extensive bruising around his torso, where the rope bit in during the fall, are consistent with a violent but not immediately fatal tumble. Some researchers believe he may have survived the initial fall, staggering onward before succumbing to a second, final fall. Critically, Mallory's body was found approximately 2,000 feet below the northeast ridge, oriented face down with arms extended upslope, suggesting he was trying to arrest his slide. The position of his body and the ice axe found in 1933, identified by marking as Irvine's, created a triangulation that allowed researchers to estimate the fall trajectory. The story didn't end on June 8, 1924. It transformed into one of exploration's most enduring mysteries. In 1933, climbers from the British Everest expedition discovered an ice axe on the northeast ridge at approximately 27,760 feet, identified by shaft markings as belonging to Irvine. The axe's position suggested it had been placed deliberately during a rest or dropped during a fall. Chinese expeditions in the 1960s and 1970s added tantalizing but frustrating clues. In 1975, Chinese climber Wang Hongbao told a teammate he had seen an English dead at about 26,570 feet. Before he could provide exact coordinates, Wang died in an avalanche. His description, a body at 8,100 meters with equipment from the 1920s, became the basis for the 1999 search that ultimately found Mallory. Even more intriguing, Wang Fuzhou, part of the first Chinese team to summit from the north in 1960, reportedly told a 1965 press conference in Russia that his team had encountered at 8,600 meters a European wearing braces, the suspender-style straps Irvine was known to wear. The account was largely dismissed at the time, but has gained credibility given the 2024 discovery. The Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition, funded by BBC and PBS Nova, launched in spring 1999 with the explicit goal of finding evidence to resolve the summit question. Conrad Anker's discovery of Mallory after just 90 minutes of searching seemed almost miraculous, until one considers that Wang Hongbao had essentially provided GPS coordinates decades earlier. The body was remarkably preserved. Mallory's clothing, 6 layers, including tweed jackets and silk undergarments, remained largely intact. His skin, bleached alabaster white by decades of UV exposure, was leathery but intact enough that researchers could identify facial features. The rope around his waist, his belt, even laundry marks on his collar survived. But no camera, no photograph of Ruth, and no summit cairnstones or summit snow samples in his pockets. The absence of Ruth's photograph has become central to the "they summited" theory. If Mallory had promised to leave it at the summit and it's not on his body, proponents argue he must have fulfilled that promise. Skeptics counter that this is circular reasoning, absence of evidence used as evidence of success. What researchers did find were spare goggles in Mallory's pocket rather than on his face, suggesting he was descending in low-light conditions when he fell, consistent with a late summit and nighttime descent. For 100 years, Sandy Irvine remained ghost. Then, in September 2024, filmmaker and climber Jimmy Chin's team made a discovery on the central Rongbuk Glacier that potentially closes half the mystery. Descending from high camp, team members spotted a boot emerging from melting ice. Inside was a partial foot, and on the sock, a red label reading A.C. Irvine. DNA testing with Irvine's descendants confirmed the identification. The location, significantly lower than Mallory's position and on a different section of the mountain, suggests the two men either fell separately or that ice and gravity moved Irvine's remains substantially over a century. The discovery effectively disproves theories that Chinese climbers had found and removed Irvine's body to preserve nationalist narratives about who first summited from the north. Most tantalizingly, where there's Irvine, there might be a camera. The Kodak vest pocket that one of them carried could theoretically still preserve images after 100 years in ice. Kodak's own testing suggests film frozen immediately after exposure could survive and be developed. If found, that camera could definitively answer whether the summit was reached or prove they turned back tantalizingly close. Arguments they reached the summit. Timing. If Odell saw them on or near the third step at 12:50 p.m., they had 5-6 hours of daylight remaining, theoretically sufficient to summit and begin descent. Oxygen capacity. Analysis of the oxygen cylinders, Irvine's modifications, and Mallory's notes suggests they had 7-8 hours of supplemental oxygen, enough for a summit push with conservative usage. Mallory's climbing ability. Contemporaries regarded him as one of the finest rock climbers of his generation, capable of technical moves others couldn't manage. The missing photograph. The absence of Ruth's photo, which Mallory reportedly promised to leave at the summit, could indicate he fulfilled that promise. Odell's belief. Noel Odell, the last person to see them and most familiar with the conditions, always believed they likely succeeded, despite pressure from the British establishment to temper such claims. Arguments, they fell short. The second step, this near-vertical rock face poses enormous difficulty even with modern equipment and fixed ropes. Climbing it in leather boots with primitive crampons or none strains credibility, especially on descent in darkness. Location of Mallory's body. Found well below the summit wrote, his position and injuries suggest a fall during descent from lower on the mountain, not from the summit area. Time constraints. A 12:50 p.m. sighting at the second step leaves an extremely narrow window, requiring rapid climbing, no delays, and immediate descent to avoid darkness. Missing camera. If they carried a camera to document the summit, why wasn't it with Mallory's body? The counter-argument, that Irvine carried it, remains speculative until his complete remains are found. Oxygen issues. Evidence of spare parts at Camp 6th suggests equipment problems that may have caused a delayed start, compressing their timeline further. A century after that fateful June day, the question remains unresolved. Unlike most historical mysteries, this one could theoretically be solved if that camera emerges from the ice with intact, developable film showing Mallory or Irvine on the summit. But perhaps the uncertainty is fitting. Mallory himself seemed to understand that Everest's significance transcended any individual achievement. When asked by a reporter why he wanted to climb the mountain, he allegedly replied, "Because it's there." a phrase that has become perhaps the most famous justification for the human impulse toward the impossible. Whether George Mallory and Sandy Irvine stood atop the world on June 8, 1924, or fell just short, their story embodies something fundamentally human: the willingness to venture into the unknown despite overwhelming odds, to pursue transcendence even at the cost of everything, to climb toward the light even when darkness is closing in. Mallory's body rests now where it fell, entombed again after the 1999 team conducted a brief burial ceremony. Somewhere on that frozen mountain, Irvine's remains are gradually emerging from a century of ice. And somewhere, perhaps scattered to the Tibetan winds, perhaps still frozen in a crevasse, perhaps in a boot or jacket pocket waiting to be found, a camera may hold the answer to one of exploration's greatest questions. For now, the mystery endures, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some truths belong to the mountain,